This is Chapter 15, Part A on the endocrine system. So endocrinology is the study of hormones and endocrine organs. So the endocrine system is going to act kind of in coordination with the nervous system to help kind of regulate activity of various body cells. So it can influence different metabolic activities using what are called hormones. So these hormones are going to be transported in the blood, so that way they have access to all of the cells and tissues throughout the body. So compared to the nervous system, the response time takes a little bit longer, but it is going to have a much more long-lasting effect than nervous system responses. So some functions of the endocrine system include control and regulation of things like reproduction, growth and development, nutrient, water balance in the blood, regulation of metabolism, your energy balance, and also mobilization of body defenses. So the immune system is also going to be regulated and influenced by certain hormones. So there's two different types of glands in the body. We've already talked about exocrine glands in 2113 last semester. So these are going to produce non-hormonal substances. So things like sweat, saliva, even your earwax glands, mammary glands, those are all exocrine. So exocrine meaning outside the body, exo. So they're going to secrete their substances outside of the body through a duct. So a duct is just kind of like a channel that transports something from one point to another. So in the case of exocrine glands, it's transporting the secretion, say the sweat, from the gland all the way to the surface of the skin. So endocrine glands, what we're going to focus on today in this chapter, are going to produce the hormones, and they're going to secrete their hormone secretions directly into the bloodstream. So because they secrete directly inside the body, they don't require ducts. So this figure here is just kind of comparing your exocrine and endocrine glands. So see here, the exocrine, we have a small duct, right, this little channel that's going to carry these secretions to the surface, whereas your endocrine glands are going to be surrounded by capillaries and blood vessels, so those cells can secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. So throughout this chapter, we're going to look at all the various types of endocrine organs and their hormones that they secrete. But endocrine glands include things like the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, adrenal glands, pineal glands, thymus, pancreas, the gonads. So the hypothalamus is considered part of the endocrine system, but it's also considered part of the nervous system. So this is kind of the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's considered to be a neuroendocrine organ. So some of these organs we'll talk about have both exocrine and endocrine functions. So example, the pancreas, the gonads, placenta, right? So the pancreas secretes digestive secretion, so that would be its exocrine function, and it also secretes hormones, so insulin and glucagon. Right? So same thing with the gonads and the placenta. Some other tissues and organs that can also produce hormones that we'll look at. So adipose cells, these are just fat cells, the thymus, some cells of the small intestine, the stomach, the kidneys, the heart. Right? So they all secrete maybe specific hormones, but they're not actually considered endocrine organs. So with the endocrine system, we're dealing with hormones, right? So hormones are essentially just chemical messengers. So they're going to send a message from one cell to another cell to make it do something, right? Change its activity. Right? So hormones that we'll talk about, these are defined as long distance chemical signals because they're able to travel in the blood or the lymph fluid. So they're able to travel pretty much all throughout the body. So long distance compared to the cell that secreted that hormone. Autocrines are chemicals that exert effects on the same cells that secrete them. So auto meaning self. So these are going to secrete substances that basically act on the cell itself. Right? So these are the autocrines. Right? So we see we secrete our hormone or our secretion, and it just turns right back around and affects that same cell. Right? So a paracrine, para means kind of beside or next to. So these are locally acting chemicals that are going to affect cells other than those that secrete them, but still nearby. So they're not traveling very long distances, so maybe within the same tissue area. So because the autocrines and paracrines are considered local chemical messengers and not long distance, we don't focus on those in the endocrine system. So there are two chemical classes of hormones, right? So amino acid-based hormones, these are things that are based off of amino acids, peptides, proteins, things like that. So then the other category would be steroids. So these are synthesized from cholesterol and include things like the sex hormones and some of the adrenocortical hormones. So the steroids come from cholesterol. So the root word stero, right? Whenever you see stero, that's telling us it's a steroid. So chemically, structurally, all steroid hormones just have kind of this basic 4-carbon ring structure within various different outgroups. So even though the hormones circulate systemically or all throughout the body, only specific cells that have certain receptors for that hormone are going to be affected by that hormone. So these are called target cells. So a target cell is just a tissue or cell that has those specific receptors for that specific hormone. So the hormone itself is going to alter the target cell activity in one way or another. So this example here, so we have our endocrine cell secreting its hormone directly into the bloodstream. So as the hormone travels through the blood, it's going to bypass any cells that do not have a receptor. Right? So once it encounters a cell with that receptor, so it reaches its target cell, so now the hormone's able to bind, kind of like a lock and key mechanism, with that receptor to activate that target cell for whatever response we're trying to elicit. So once a hormone reaches its target cell, it could change the activity or the function of that cell in a few different ways. So one way could be altering the permeability of the plasma membrane. So this could allow different ions and substances to cross the membrane in and out of the cell, which would change its functions. We could stimulate synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. So enzymes are biological catalysts that are going to help to speed up our biochemical reactions in the cell. Hormones can activate or deactivate these enzymes as well as synthesize them. It can induce secretory activity, so we can tell a cell to secrete something else. It can also stimulate mitosis or cell division, so we can encourage growth and division of new cells. So just like we said, there were two classes, chemical classes of hormones. So that's going to dictate their function or their mechanism of action. So hormones can act generally in one of two ways, depending on that chemical structure. So the first way would be your water-soluble hormones. So these are all the amino acid-based ones except the thyroid. Right? So they can act on the plasma membrane receptors, but they can't actually enter the cell themselves. Right? So they rely on the second messenger systems. Right? So our second class, your lipid-soluble hormones, include your steroids and thyroid hormones. So these, since they're lipid-soluble, they can directly enter the cell through that plasma membrane and directly activate the genes. Okay, so this is showing how your amino acid-based hormones or the water-soluble hormones are going to rely on these second messenger systems. Now, you don't need to know all these specific steps. Just know that generally the hormone, since it cannot pass through the cell membrane, so the hormone's water-soluble, right? So remember, what is the cell membrane made out of? Right, so it's made out of phospholipids. So just like oil and water don't mix, so these water-soluble hormones aren't going to be able to pass through this lipid bilayer. So they're going to rely on some protein receptors on the membrane that's then going to kind of transfer that message and that information to its final destination. Now, the second class, we said the lipid-soluble steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, because they're lipid-soluble and the membrane is also composed of lipids, right? So like dissolves like. So lipid-soluble hormones will be able to pass directly through that lipid bilayer in the membrane. So once it passes through the plasma membrane, it can bind to an intracellular receptor. So it can also help to bind to specific regions of DNA for transcription and protein synthesis. Um, so protein synthesis, essentially, so all of your genetic information is in the DNA, right? So how to make all the proteins, how to make one of you instructions, right? Recipe is in the DNA. So when we transcript and translate this information, we make a copy of it with mRNA, right? And then the mRNA is translated into the protein. So we're essentially going from the recipe in the cookbook in the DNA to an actual functional cake, right, that we can eat. Okay, so just a summary table now, compare and contrast these lipid-soluble hormones versus water-soluble hormones. Right, so again, your lipid-soluble hormones include all the steroid hormones plus thyroid hormone. Right? So some sources of these would be from the adrenal cortex, the gonads, or the sex organs, and the thyroid gland. So they're transported, bound to plasma proteins in the blood. They have a longer half-life in the blood than the water-soluble. Generally, if something is water-soluble, it has or remains in the body for a shorter period of time. So it's essentially going to be flushed out, right, with your urine and sweat and other body fluids in a relatively short period of time. Whereas things that are lipid-soluble tend to hang on to the fat cells and stick around a little bit longer. So lipid-soluble hormone location of receptors, we said, is typically going to be inside the cell because they are lipid-soluble. They're capable of crossing that lipid bilayer membrane. So their mechanism of action would be that direct gene activation. Right? So they pass straight through the membrane and go to the DNA and activate those genes to synthesize those proteins. Right? So your water-soluble hormones is everything else. So all the amino acid-based hormones, again, except for thyroid hormone, it's a little bit different. And its half-life, like I mentioned, is a little bit shorter because it can be removed by the kidneys, right? So it can be flushed out pretty quickly with other body fluids. The location of these water-soluble hormone receptors would be on the plasma membrane, right? So these guys can't pass the membrane, so water and oil don't mix. So they rely on these second messenger systems. So the control of hormone release is going to be regulated by what's called a negative feedback system. So essentially, once the hormone has done its job and we don't need it anymore, we go back to the source and turn it off. Right? So an increased hormone effects on target organ can inhibit further hormone release. Right? So just like everything in the body, we have very narrow kind of homeostatic ranges for certain body functions. So if we go outside of that range and start this process of a negative feedback loop. So this example here, so we have high blood sugar right after a meal. Right? So blood glucose levels have increased. So in response to that, the pancreas will release insulin into the blood. Right? So insulin directly into the bloodstream where it travels through the circulatory system and reaches the liver and the body cells. So insulin triggers or stimulates the liver to convert glucose to glycogen, to take any excess glucose and convert it into kind of the storage form that we use. And also stimulates the body cells to take up the glucose out of the blood and use it for their own energy and metabolisms. So once the cells have taken up the glucose, the liver's taken up the excess glucose, right? So blood glucose levels are going to decrease, right, back to that normal homeostatic range. So once we've restored homeostasis, we'll stop producing insulin. We'll turn off the pancreas producing insulin, right, until the next time our homeostasis is disrupted. These negative feedback loops work with pretty much every hormone we're going to talk about, exception of a couple that I'll mention. But essentially, right, once the hormone has done its job, we've restored homeostasis. We no longer need that hormone to be produced, so we go back to the source of the hormone and turn it off. So endocrine glands are stimulated to synthesize and release their hormones in response to a few different types of stimuli. So it could be a humoral stimuli, meaning in the blood or in the body fluids, neural stimuli from the nervous system, or hormonal stimuli. So some hormones cause the release of other hormones that we'll talk about. So looking at humoral stimuli first, so this would be any changes in the blood levels of ions or nutrients can stimulate the secretion of certain hormones. So one example is calcium level in the blood. So calcium is important for lots of bodily functions, so we want to make sure our calcium stays within, right, those homeostatic ranges. So if we have a decline blood calcium concentration, that's going to stimulate the parathyroid glands to secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone, PTH. Right? So that one's pretty easy. But PTH causes calcium concentrations to rise. Right? So once calcium levels are restored to homeostasis, right, so we'll turn off the hormone production at the parathyroid gland. So that's just what this is showing here, right? With our humoral stimulus, we detect low calcium levels in the blood, right? So the parathyroid glands are actually these little small yellow glands embedded in the sides of the thyroid itself. Right? So again, para means beside or next to. So the parathyroid glands are kind of beside or on the sides of the thyroid. Right? But the low blood calcium is going to be detected, right, by the parathyroid glands, and they secrete their parathyroid hormone, right, which is going to result in an increase of blood calcium level. So we'll talk more about parathyroid hormone in a little bit. But essentially how it does this is it can stimulate the osteoclasts in the bone, so the bone breakdown cells, to free up some calcium, take it out of the bones. We can increase our calcium absorption in the intestines and also in the kidneys. So neural stimuli is another one. So this would be stimulation from the nervous system. So the nerve fibers themselves are what's stimulating these endocrine organs. So typically it's going to be that sympathetic nervous system that stimulates things like the adrenal medulla to secrete things like epinephrine. So remember from 2113, the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight. Right? So your sympathetic nervous system, if you're in a fight or flight situation, like a life or death situation, right, it's going to release these or stimulate these neurons to the medulla to secrete epinephrine. So epinephrine is essentially adrenaline. So you all know what it's like when your adrenaline's pumping, right? So it can increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, and different things like that. So the third stimulus would be a hormonal stimuli. So this would be one hormone stimulating the release of another hormone. So these are also sometimes called tropic hormones. So whenever you see the word tropic, that just means it's a stimulating hormone. So hormones stimulate other endocrine organs to release their hormones. So hypothalamic hormones stimulate release of most of your anterior pituitary hormones. We'll talk about a little more in depth in a little bit. Anterior pituitary hormones stimulate their targets to secrete more hormones. So here the anterior pituitary is secreting tropic hormones or stimulatory hormones to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete its hormone, or stimulate the adrenal gland to secrete its hormone, stimulate the gonad to secrete its hormones. So this is all part of kind of a negative feedback loop, right? So the hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop just means that hormones from those final target organs are going to release any further production of those anterior pituitary hormones. So, example, the thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone, which is basically your metabolism hormone, major metabolic hormone, right? So, the pituitary gland is going to secrete a thyroid stimulating hormone, right? So now the thyroid stimulated and secretes thyroid hormone. So once we have enough thyroid hormone in the blood, that's going to send feedback or negative feedback all the way to the pituitary, so we turn off that thyroid stimulating hormone production. So nervous system modulation just means that the nervous system ultimately is control, right, and can make adjustments to hormone levels when needed. It can also override our normal endocrine functions. So again, back to that sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight nervous system. So under severe stress, the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system can override, say, insulin production to allow your blood glucose levels to stay elevated, so that your cells have, right, a readily available energy source if you need to run away or fight off, right, somebody. Target cell specificity. What we mentioned before, that hormones only respond to cells that have those specific receptors, right? So those target cells. So target cells have to have that receptor for the hormone to bind to it. So one example given here, ACTH is the receptors are found only on certain cells in the adrenal cortex, right? So ACTH stands for Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So remember, tropic meaning it stimulates for another hormone. So adrenocortico tells us it stimulates the adrenal cortex. Right? So another hormone, though, that's a little more ubiquitous or used by more types of cells, like thyroxine or thyroid hormone, these are going to be found on nearly all cells of the body. So target cell activation depends on three factors. Right? So one would be the blood levels of the hormone, the relative number of receptors either on or in a target cell, and then the affinity or how strong that receptor and hormone are able to bind together. Right, so the more hormone you have in the blood, right, the more likely it'll be to have an effect, or maybe the stronger the effect will be. Same thing with number of receptors on the cell. So the more receptors we have, the more hormone we can bind. Right? And with affinity, so the stronger the bond, or the more easily they're able to bind together, right, is going to help facilitate that interaction. So when we look at the way that levels of hormone can influence the number of receptors, this is upregulation and downregulation. So depending on if we need more receptors or we need less receptors, again, depending on the amount of hormone or hormone levels in the blood, right? So we can increase or decrease the number of receptors for our purposes. So with upregulation, target cells are going to form more receptors in response to low hormone levels. So there's not as much hormone molecules or as many hormone molecules available. So they're trying to increase their chances of maybe potentially catching one. So we do that by increasing the number of receptors we have available. So downregulation would be the opposite. So target cells will decrease their number of receptors in response to high hormone levels. So say we have lots of receptors and lots of hormones, so we don't want all of the receptors to bind to all of the hormone, so we decrease the number of receptors, so we're not taking on all of the hormone at the same time. So essentially this can desensitize the target cell and prevent them from overreacting to persistently high levels of hormones. So like we said before, hormones, these long distance chemical messengers, are going to circulate in the blood throughout the bloodstream. Usually either free or bound. So bound would just mean that they're bound to some type of plasma protein in the blood. So the steroids and the thyroid hormones are generally going to be attached to plasma proteins because remember we said they are lipid soluble. And a big component of blood is water, right, or fluid. So in order for these steroids to be able to transport throughout the blood, right, they're attached to plasma protein just to kind of help carry them through that water or plasma fluid. So this concentration of circulating hormone is going to be a reflection of the rate of the release and the speed at which it's inactivated and removed from the body. So the faster we can produce hormones, right? So we're producing them, releasing them at a faster rate. That's going to increase our concentration. But at the same time, if we have enzymes that are able to quickly inactivate and remove these hormones, then that could decrease our concentration. So hormones can be removed from the body by things like enzymes, degrading enzymes, or filtered through the kidneys or the liver. So when we talk about the half-life of a hormone, it's essentially the time it takes for the level of that hormone in the blood to decrease by half. So depending on the hormone, it could vary from just a few minutes to weeks. So depending on the hormone, like I said. So going back to that water-soluble versus lipid-soluble. So the water-soluble hormones, things like your amino acid-based hormones, right? They're going to be flushed out of the body fluids and filtered by the kidneys much more quickly than, say, your lipid-soluble hormones, which tend to hang around and stick to your lipid or your fat cells for a little longer. So some hormones have different response times. So some responses are immediate. So things like your epinephrine, right, your adrenal cortex hormones. Some, like steroids, can take hours to days. They have to kind of build up in your system a little bit longer to have an effect. And generally, some are going to be inactive until they enter their target cells. So once they've reached their target cells, the duration of the response is usually limited, from 10 seconds to several hours. Effects may disappear rapidly as blood levels of the hormones drop, but some could even persist for hours at these lower levels. So sometimes multiple hormones may act on the same target cell at the same time. So there's a couple different types of interactions that different hormones can have. So one way hormones can interact is permissiveness. So this would be where one hormone can't exert its effects without another hormone being present. So they kind of need permission from that second hormone to carry out their function. So this example here says reproductive hormones would need thyroid hormone to have an effect, which would make sense. So there's no sense in putting in the energy to make these reproductive hormones and put the energy and time and effort into reproduction if, right, our thyroid hormone isn't present or our metabolism is too low. Synergism is another type of interaction. So this would be where more than one hormone produces the same effects on the target cell, essentially causing like an amplification, or think of like a snowball effect. So this example, glucagon and epinephrine can both cause the liver to release glucose. So if we were to release both of these hormones at the same time, right, so we would release, think, twice the amount of glucose as we would with just glucagon or just epinephrine. And then the third type of interaction is an antagonism. So this would be where one or more hormones are going to oppose the action of another hormone. So think like in your English classes, right? So in stories, you have the protagonist, the main character, and then you always have an antagonist that's going to oppose or be against your main character. So here with antagonism, the two hormones are opposed to one another, and they essentially are going to do the opposite. So this example, insulin and glucagon. So we talked about insulin before, so that one's pretty fairly well known. Insulin lowers blood sugar, right? So then glucagon, if it's going to be antagonistic, it's going to do the opposite. So it increases blood glucose levels. And as we go through this chapter and talk about the different types of hormones, you'll see that a lot of them actually have an antagonistic partner. So for whatever one hormone does, there's generally going to be another hormone that undoes it. Okay, so now we can get into looking at the individual endocrine organs, the endocrine system, starting with the hypothalamus, right, and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland via a little stalk called the infundibulum. The pituitary is going to secrete at least 8 major hormones that we'll look at today. So it's essentially kind of like 2 separate organs in one, because it's composed of 2 different types of tissues. So the 2 major lobes of the pituitary are the posterior pituitary. So this is going to be composed of the neural tissue. And the anterior pituitary is going to consist of a glandular tissue. So I said the posterior lobe is actually neural tissue derived from growth, outpocketing of the brain. Right? So as you see, so I have this neural connection here. So it's going to maintain this neural connection to the hypothalamus via the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Say that 5 times fast. So it secretes 2 major hormones that we'll look at, oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So generally these hormones will be stored in the axon terminals within that posterior pituitary and are only going to be released into the blood when those neurons fire and send that signal. So the hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones to the anterior pituitary to help regulate their hormone secretion. So some of the hypothalamic hormones, releasing and inhibiting hormones include things like your growth hormone releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, right? So these are going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete its growth hormone or thyroid stimulating hormone, right? And adrenocorticotropic hormone. So we'll look at all of these hormones a little more in depth as we go along. Okay, so starting with the posterior pituitary hormone, since there's only 2. Right? So the first one we'll look at is oxytocin. So oxytocin sometimes referred to as the love hormone, but some of its functions include being strong stimulant of uterine contractions during childbirth, acts as a hormonal trigger for milk ejection, and this is one of the rare ones is actually going to operate under a positive feedback mechanism. Right? So we talked about negative feedback mechanism before where essentially once the hormone's done its job, we turn it off. So with oxytocin, since it's stimulating things like uterine contractions and milk ejection, right, we don't want to turn that off. We want to increase that. We want it to keep going, right, and build in intensity. So positive feedback is kind of like that snowball effect. So it just keeps building and getting more intense of an effect. So like I said, oxytocin is sometimes referred to as the love hormone. So it's also responsible for those feelings of attachment and closeness, particularly between a mother and child, right? It helps to establish that bond. So if you've ever been around a nursing mother, right, or if you've breastfed yourself or your child yourself. So, you know, when you hear your baby cry, or really any baby cry, or just get close to your baby, right, that can trigger release of that oxytocin, give you that kind of lovey feeling, and you would have a milk letdown and soak your shirt. Right, so the second posterior pituitary hormone is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So if something's a diuretic, it's going to increase urine production. Right? So it's going to stimulate urine production or make you urinate more. So an antidiuretic hormone is going to be, think, anti-urination. So it's essentially going to target the kidneys to reabsorb more water to prevent or inhibit that urine formation. So it's released in response to solute concentrations in the blood. Right? So say if concentration of the blood gets too high, right? So we need more water in the blood. So we'll release that ADH from the posterior pituitary, which would then tell the kidneys to reabsorb more water, right, and return it to the blood. So release of ADH can also be triggered by pain, low blood pressure, and certain drugs. This would also operate under a negative feedback. So once we have adequate hydration, right, we have our homeostasis of our concentration of the blood, right, ADH production would be turned off. So ADH is also inhibited by alcohol and diuretics. So if you've ever drinking a few beers or some alcohol, one of the side effects is you have to pee a lot, right? Because we're essentially turning off all of that ADH, so all of our fluid, right, our water is just going to go right through us, through our kidneys. So this would also be what contributes to hangovers the next day, right? Essentially, you're dehydrated because you've lost your ADH and you've lost too much body fluids. So high concentrations of ADH can also cause vasoconstriction. So sometimes it's referred to as vasopressin, right? So vasoconstriction is where we constrict the blood vessels to increase blood pressure. So there are 6 hormones produced in the anterior pituitary. Right? So all of them except the growth hormone are going to operate through that second messenger system. And then also all of them except 2 are going to act as a tropic hormone. Right? So remember we said tropic hormones stimulate the secretion of other hormones. So we'll look a little more in depth at each of these as we go through. But we have growth hormone, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone, which is tropic, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? Stimulating hormone. Generally, your tropic hormones would have stimulating or tropic right there in the name. Okay? Luteinizing hormone and prolactin. So growth hormone does essentially what it sounds like it does. So it stimulates growth and metabolism. So it does this by triggering the liver to break down glycogen into glucose, right? Increase blood levels of fatty acids, cellular uptake of nutrients. So essentially it allows the cells to grow and divide, and gives them everything they need, all the fuel, the energy, right, the basic building blocks, materials to make new cells and tissues. So while growth hormone stimulates pretty much all cells one way or another, its major targets are going to be the bone and skeletal muscle. So growth hormone release or inhibition is primarily regulated by one of those hypothalamic hormones that we mentioned. right? It's one of those releasing and inhibiting hormones. So growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, is going to stimulate growth hormone, right? Just right there in the name. So this is triggered by, if we have low levels of growth hormone in the blood or low levels of glucose, can trigger this. So if we want to inhibit growth hormone, we would secrete growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Right? So again, it's right there in the name. Right? So this could be triggered by an increase in growth hormone. So if we have too much growth hormone, we need to dial it back a bit, right? We need to turn it off some. Ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, can also stimulate growth hormone release in anticipation of the intake of those nutrients from the food. So this is just showing kind of how growth hormone works, right? So has direct and indirect actions, but they all have the same basic end result, right? We're increasing cell division, cell growth, bone, skeletal muscles. So increasing blood sugar in the blood, increasing fats in the blood, protein synthesis, cell growth, and formation of skeletal tissues. So some homeostatic imbalances we can see with growth hormone would be either a hypersecretion or a hyposecretion. So a hypersecretion is usually caused by a tumor, something pressing on that anterior pituitary to kind of overstimulate it to release too much growth hormone. So in children, this results in gigantism, where individuals can reach heights of 8 feet tall. If it happens later in adulthood or continues throughout adulthood, it can result in acromegaly, which is an overgrowth of hands, feet, and the skull. So one famous person that had gigantism or a hypersecretion of growth hormone would be Andre the Giant, who was almost 8 feet tall and like 500 pounds. But with the facial features, kind of the large brow and the jaw, would be result from that acromegaly. So on the opposite side of the spectrum, if we have a hyposecretion, so not enough growth hormone, so in children would result in what's called pituitary dwarfism. So these individuals may only reach heights of 4 feet tall or so. So if this happens in adults after adulthood, it usually doesn't really cause any problems since we're already done growing. But with children, while they're their prime growing stages, if they're not getting enough growth hormone, they never reach their full height potential. So famous person that had type of pituitary dwarfism, right, was Vern Troyer, Mini-Me from Austin Powers. So this is actually not the same type of dwarfism as an achondroplasia dwarfism. So with like Peter Dinklage, right, or Tyrion from Game of Thrones. So this type of dwarfism is actually genetic. Right? It doesn't really have anything to do with the pituitary gland per se. Right. So thyroid stimulating hormone is our next anterior pituitary hormone. This is a tropic hormone. So it's going to stimulate the release of a different hormone. Right. So sometimes it's called thyrotropin. You may see it referred to that. But thyro, right, tells us thyroid. Tropin means it's tropic, right, or stimulating. So thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the normal development and activity of the thyroid. And its release is triggered by thyrotropin releasing hormone, so TRH, from the hypothalamus. Right? So using negative feedback, right? So once blood levels of thyroid hormone reach those homeostatic levels, right, we can go back to inhibit and turn off our TRH and TSH production. Okay? So again, this little flow chart is just showing the hypothalamus. Right, it's going to secrete that thyrotropin releasing hormone, right, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, right, which is then going to stimulate the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormones. Right, so the thyroid hormone is going to be what actively interacts with those target cells. So once thyroid hormone levels have stabilized, so they're at homeostasis, we don't need any more thyroid hormone, we're good, right? So then we go back to the source, right? So we cut off the TRH and we cut off the TSH. Now, if we were to only go back and cut off the TSH at the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is still producing TRH, then the anterior pituitary would still be stimulated to make more TSH, which would then stimulate the thyroid gland. So you see, we want to go all the way back to the original source of kind of this pathway to turn it off. So our next anterior pituitary hormone is ACTH, or Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Right? So this is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, right? So it's right there in the name. Adrenocortico tells us adrenal cortex. Tropic tells us it's going to stimulate release of another hormone. Okay? So regulation of ACTH is going to be triggered by that corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, from the hypothalamus. Okay? So hypothalamus will secrete its corticotropin releasing hormone. That's going to trigger the pituitary gland to secrete ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete cortisol or other corticosteroids. And this will also operate under a negative feedback, right? So once cortisol levels have reached what we require, right? So we'll go all the way back to the hypothalamus to turn off the CRH, which would in turn turn off the ACTH, which would turn off the cortisol. Okay. So our next anterior pituitary hormones are the gonadotropins, right? So FSH and LH, right? So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Right? So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is going to stimulate production of the gametes. So gametes are sperm or eggs. Right? Luteinizing hormone promotes production of the sex hormones. So in females, it helps to trigger ovulation and produce estrogen and progesterone. Okay? And in males, it stimulates the production of that testosterone. So both of these hormones are typically going to be absent before puberty, right? Since they're sex hormones and have to do with the reproductive system, they're generally offline until puberty. Right. So during and after puberty, so once the reproductive system kind of comes online and starts developing, a hypothalamus or hypothalamic hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, right, GnRH, is going to stimulate the pituitary to secrete this FSH and LH. Okay? So hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone, stimulates pituitary to secrete follicle stimulating hormone. So follicle stimulating is going to stimulate those follicles to develop into either sperm or eggs. The luteinizing hormone from the pituitary is going to stimulate secretion of those sex hormones, so estrogens, testosterone. And again, this would also work with a negative feedback, right? So once we get enough testosterone levels are high enough, so then we'll go back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary to turn them off, right, through that negative feedback loop. Right. So prolactin, our next anterior pituitary hormone. So this is going to stimulate milk production in females. As of today, the role in males not well understood. They do produce small amounts of prolactin, but we're not sure what it does. But in females, it's going to stimulate milk production. So prolactin, prolactation, right? So its regulation is primarily controlled by a prolactin inhibiting hormone, or dopamine. So this can prevent the release of prolactin until it's needed, with decreased levels leading to that lactation. So this is another one that is generally a positive feedback loop, right? So we talked about oxytocin was a positive feedback loop for uterine contractions and milk ejection. So prolactin, same thing with a positive feedback. So we don't want to turn it off when we start to make the milk, right? So we want to make more milk, so we need more prolactin. Okay? So increased estrogen levels can stimulate prolactin. So this is generally the reason why breasts tend to get swollen and kind of tender during the menstrual cycle. And then toward the end of pregnancy, prolactin levels rise to start to get the milk production started. So then after the baby's born, suckling of the infant can stimulate prolactin release and promote continued production of milk. So that positive feedback. Okay, so just to finish up with a summary of all of these pituitary hormones we've looked at so far. Okay, so growth hormone, we said primary targets were the bones and skeletal muscle, and can also trigger the liver to release more glucose. So hyposecretion of growth hormone, so not enough, would result in a pituitary dwarfism. Too much growth hormone would result in gigantism. So your thyroid stimulating hormone is stimulated by that thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And it's going to target the thyroid gland, right, to secrete thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, stimulated by that corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. And it's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete the glucocorticoids, so things like cortisol or stress hormones. So follicle stimulating hormone, we said, was going to stimulate the ovaries and the testes to produce sperm and eggs. Luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate production of those sex hormones, things like testosterone and estrogen. And prolactin is the lactation hormone, so it's prolactation. It's going to stimulate milk production in the breasts.